What's up, everybody? It's your boy, Z Money. Round two in the books. We got the matchups for the conference finals. So I'm going to lay down the final round of predictions here, and then we'll get on with life and move into the next season. All right, so starting in the East, the Heat beat the Hawks. Now, I'm pretty sure, I forget my prediction. I'm pretty sure I said the Heat 4 in 7 over the Hawks. I forget if I said the Hawks or the Heat in 7, but I said in 7. I've always been liking this Heat squad. I didn't think they had the talent level of the Pacers specifically. I definitely like the Pacers to win the East at the beginning of all this. But this panned out. The scale with which the Heat were better was unexpected, but the overall vibe was what I expected, which is that the Heat have an actual good team, and the Hawks just, don't. Basically, Arthas went off against Marty Taylor, who's just a useless sack of crap. I just don't get why Kyle continues to stick with him. And that's the main story of the game. And the other piece is that the Hawks, who don't have efficient shooters, their shooters never looked efficient. Keegan Murray, Jason Jackson, Jamel Abraham, just none of them could ever get effective, 60% true shooting games with any consistency. There was multiple games. I mean, it was only 4 games, but it just felt like everybody was shooting 4 of 10, 4 of 15, 5 of 15, shit like that all over the place. Meanwhile, the Heat were getting really consistent offense from Arthas. American did okay against Granny. Granny wasn't super high volume in this, so that's another big problem for the Hawks is that guys like Keegan Murray and Jamel Abraham and Jason Jackson will just steal the ball from Granny, and they're so inefficient. You just want to force feed Granny. Anyways, Heat look great. They move on. The Hawks, the perennial playoff letdowns. I mean, the seas really parted for the Hawks this year, and goddamn did they fuck it up. It's a kind of a weird year to go to the finals because you're in the East because you're probably going to lose. But there's nothing wrong with going, and they had a great chance to do it. In the other half of the bracket, the Magic and the Sixers played a fantastic series. Didn't go 7, but it was a back and forth, fun affair, finished by a 1-point game 6. So lots of good drama. And if I'm not mistaken, in that game 6, it was a mega choke by the Magic, who I think were leading a bunch, and then choked it away. In any case, what did we see from this series? All right. I think Jake, and to be fair, I was kind of the opinion that he should do this. My learning is that the playing Zong Fang and playing these only offense guys against the Sixers was not the way to go. Omer Rosenberg did really good. And why did Omer Rosenberg do really good, in my opinion? Because he spent half of his time playing against a guy with F- defense in Zong Fang, who had an unbelievable series offensively in his own right. He was at 70% true shooting. He was scoring 15, 17, 20 points a game. That was all great. The problem was, to play Zong, you have to get rid of Milan Garrett at the power forward slot, who is the guy who could actually stop Omer Rosenberg. So Milan Garrett, classic starting power forward, playing 32 minutes a game. He was playing 20 minutes a game, which is fine. But I think actually, in retrospect, now that I've seen how it played out, you would have preferred to have a little defense to limit Omer, because everybody's going to score against Omer, right? If you look at Milan Garrett's lines in this game, they were very good. Granted, not as high volume as you might like, but they were good while he was on the court. So outside of that, there wasn't a ton to talk about. I mean, Rosenberg was going off. He was putting up 40 points a game. His stats for the playoffs, he's clearly the playoff MVP at this point. Also due to the fact that some of the Jazz star players that you would expect to be the MVPs are struggling. But now the question is, can Omer continue it against the Heat? And I think, the Magic were average. I think the Heat have a really good matchup against Omer Rosenberg and Arthas, right? The thing about Omer is a one-way player. And that's all good and well until you face a proper two-way player to play against. And now he finally has that in Arthas, right? Arthas is doing 26 points per game on 61% true shooting, and he's an A-post defender who's athletic. So for Alex, it's not complicated. For Jake, the problem with Milan Garrett is that if you play Milan, maybe you get some defense on Omer because he's big and he plays okay defense, not the best. But the problem is he doesn't score the ball. So you're not taking advantage of Omer's awful defense. Arthas absolutely will. Arthas is going to lead this team in shots, absolutely no question, and he's going to play defense. it's worrying if you're Jack and the Sixers. Is it so worrying that you move Omer off of his clear power forward spot to small forward or to center? I don't know. It's tricky because if you move Omer over to either of those positions, I think the matchup gets a lot worse for him. I don't think it gets any better because the Heat have Gil Benson, who's like a great small forward at that small forward spot. And the Heat don't have to sacrifice any of their offense, right? Arthas is still going to take the ball to the hoop, and you don't have a good defender for him. And then if you put American against Omer, it's interesting, but I just think it might be trying too hard. You probably want Bubba Day in there getting the boards. Bubba Day is still a good player, and like, is he going to be a good matchup against Arthas, who's a little quicker, got a little better athleticism? I don't know. I think it would be in my head if I was Jack. The big advantage for Jack is he gets home court, but I like the matchup in favor of the Heat. Again, like, the big difference is the Heat have two-way players. Takashi and Arthas, although Takashi is a proper elite two-way player, Arthas is like not quite the best two-way power forward I'd ever want. Like, you could do a little better, but he's still a damn good two-way player, while the Sixers just have zero two-way players. Also, if Lytris is really going to be the point guard for the 76ers, I mean, Takashi just going to go off. Like, Lytris, 5'11". I don't care what his defensive ratings is. An unathletic 5'11" guy versus Takashi is just going to be insane. I like the Heat a lot in this one. I think I'm going to take the Heat in 6. But credit to the Sixers. I think a lot of it broke their way, dodging the Pacers. But they also, in a sense, outperformed my expectations in this Magic series. I mean, I thought it would be close, but Omer did better than I thought he would. So kudos to Jack for that. But I've got the Heat moving on. All right, in the West. Okay, both these West teams, the Sonics and the Jazz, I mean, this was the matchup that we all expected. This is like, I think this is the third time in 4 seasons the Jazz and the Sonics have played in the conference finals. There was a gap year 2 seasons ago. But both these teams look bad in doing it, in my opinion. The Sonics scraped by against the Nuggets in a 7-game series. Going back and looking at it, the Sonics, by the time it all panned out, obviously everything, when you're looking at a team that's down 3-0, of course the takeaway is like, and especially when they're the favorite, it's like, holy shit, they're awful. And then the next 4 games come on, you get another set of data, and you kind of go like, well, was it that crazy for the Sonics to go 7 against the Nuggets? I don't think so. The Nuggets are an extremely good team. I think I predicted it as a 6-game series. And when we saw how the margins of all the games panned out, there was a couple close games that the Sonics lost. I think the Sonics went 1-2 in close games, and then one by like 10 and 2 by like 30. So after all is said and done, I think there was a clear margin in favor of the Sonics. Albeit, it's always going to feel like the team sneaks by if you go 7, let alone you do the 3-0 reverse, the reverse sweep on a 3-0 deficit. In terms of how it happened, no, the Sonics just do the same thing every time. They're the best team ball in the league. Michael Lewis continues to look only okay. It's just tricky because he just keeps facing like teams that are basically 100% indexing on him. In this case, the Nuggets benched Erskine Abdul, which I'll talk about Erskine in a second, for Teofilo Cabral, who's like, I don't know. It's just another guy who happens to be a great anti-3 guard. And despite all this, it's not like Michael Lewis is choking Shane Sullivan-esque like we saw with the Pacers. Michael Lewis is just not playing amazing. He's at 55% true shooting, and I don't have the rest of his stats in front of me. So obviously the Sonics are hoping for a lot more. But Seth Charles held his own against McQuaid. McQuaid is super up and down for the Nuggets. Like, McQuaid had a 45 bomb, 46 bomb where he looks amazing, but he also had multiple sub-20 point games. I think he had 4 out of 7 sub-20. I think a couple of those were due to minutes, but a couple of those were just because he sucked. And I think this is going to be the constant dilemma with McQuaid. On defense, while he didn't really stop Seth Charles super well, I don't know if anybody can stop these elite centers. He gives you defense you want. He gets boards. He gets blocks. It's great. Offensively, I just think the Nuggets need another piece that isn't Abdul, because I just don't get why you're even giving minutes to Erskine Abdul. Like, there's kind of 2 pieces to it. I get if you are low on assets and you literally can't find another player other than Erskine Abdul, But to willingly give him the max contract when you could have I don't know what the asset situation is, but in my opinion, there are dudes you could have signed for an MLE significantly better than Erskine Abdul for your team that would just make the Nuggets so much better. I think if you take away the 23 points Erskine Abdul is shooting, so you could give those, A, hopefully McQuaid takes some of them. B, hopefully Matthew Dorsey, who's efficient, takes 2 or 3 more points per game. Hopefully Ariagato takes those. And then, of course, you get a chance with this $20 million cap to acquire some other player that could be useful. So, Abdul has been awful these entire playoffs. He threw some matches in this series that could have been the difference maker. He went 9 for 23, 5 for 20 in some of these losses, 7 for 17 in these losses against the Sonics when they choked. And his best game against the Sonics, it's not like he was the game wrecker. His best game, he went 11 for 20. 11 for 20 for 23 points. Oh, he had a 10 for 19 for 28 points because he got a bunch of free throws. But in terms of just raw shooting percentages, 10 for 19, not that great. And that's the best he gave him. So I told in Zachetology, I said Evan should bench Abdul. And while he didn't really do it. He only did it in name and not in true spirit because he still was giving him 30 plus minutes a game. So I'm not a big fan of that move. Again, this Nuggets roster, I'm super impressed with how they ended the season with the plus 12 and being the 3rd seed because of the loss of Skeeter. But this team has so much potential, but so many problems and so few assets. I don't know. Evans really got himself in a corner right now. He has a shitload of cap this coming off season. There's some guys you would argue I don't know if he needs to re-sign, but boy, you really want Ariagato back, I'd imagine. Losing Ariagato, it's going to be hard to replace that. But you still have cap to maybe sign one other person. I know McQuaid needs a deal. It'll be interesting. The Nuggets, the way they did it all, I think they just went in a year too early. And I don't know. Maybe Evan will prove me wrong, but it just seems hard for him to keep pulling this off. This year was a big shock. All right, on to the Jazz versus Rockets. Look, the Jazz won 4-1, and if you just look at that in isolation, you're probably saying, well, yeah, that seems about right. Jazz kind of rolled. Jazz kind of dodged a bullet in this one. Games 1 and 2, they won by 2 points and by 3 points. And if either of those games flip, or if both of them flip, then we could have seen a 7-game series. Why is this happening? It's hard to say, but Rycourt does not look very good this season. This playoffs, let me say. He had a fantastic season. He's the MVP. So only a bad postseason. He's at 61% true shooting on 32 points per game, which is obviously the stat line of a top 10 player in the league without question, if not higher. However, we know what Rycourt is capable of, and it's so much more than this. Randy Brown also struggling. Injuries, and also just not so crazy for a guard to struggle from deep, which Randy Brown has been doing. That variation is more expected. And it's not hard to understand why it's happening, right? Because when you look at the Broncos, I see Denver Bradford. I'm looking at a Denver Bradford stat line right now, and I'm just Denver Broncos. When you look at the Rockets, it's their paint defense is okay, but Rycourt specifically got a matchup against 2 players, Richard Johnson and Julian Bowie. And Richard Johnson, while he's a good defender, is an absolute foul machine. And it's not like he's an elite defender, right? His athleticism is lacking. He's not as tall as Rycourt, right? Rycourt's a nice 7 foot, while Johnson's 6'10". And then Bowie is just not a great post defender, although he's a hyper athlete at 6'9". And for whatever reason, that seemed to work better than basically anybody could do against the Jazz. Was it truly because of those players? Was it because Denver Bradford and Thomas McDonald were roaming in the paint alongside that? Really hard to say. But the Jazz look beatable. Now, had the Jazz done this and the Sonics rolled the Nuggets, I might have been well, this looks like a great opportunity for the Sonics to potentially steal one. Both these teams didn't look great. I think when we look at the matchups, we've seen this matchup a bunch. We kind of know what to expect. Seth Charles is going to try to outcompete Rycourt, and he has failed to do so in the past. And Randy Brown has gotten the better of Michael Lewis. I think the Rycourt Seth Charles thing, nothing's going to change. Michael Lewis is a tough one. Michael Lewis had a bad postseason last postseason as well. He finished it in quite poor, I think, at 50% true shooting flat. So although he's still not at this elite level like he's shown he can do in the regular season, I think Michael Lewis has clearly grown a tier from last season, and Randy Brown is more or less the same player he was. So if there is a chance for the Sonics, it's going to be that matchup, right? It's going to be Michael Lewis finally getting the better of Randy Brown. I think the Sonics have gotten better on the edges of the team, and the Jazz have gotten worse. You remember the Jazz team last season had like Frederick Jones, a much better and younger Chance Roman. Chance is really, he hasn't fallen off the cliff by any stretch, but he's fallen. It's just not like he's useless anymore. So I do think while the Jazz have a superior lead here, the Sonics are actually closing the gap. I don't think it's enough to favor the Sonics. I still think I like the Jazz in 6 games. But the pieces are there, right? If Seth Charles is on his best behavior and can slow down Rycourt, the rest of it I actually don't know if I prefer the Jazz over the Sonics, right? I like the Sonics bench more. I like the Sonics role players more. I've never been a big Jewel Hammock believer. Granted, he's having a really good playoffs, but it's just like I still feel like Jewel Hammock is just empty stats. All that being said, Rycourt, even if he's been bad so far, has just been a killer against the Sonics for forever. I've got to favor the Jazz in this one. I'm going to take the Jazz in 6. But secretly, as the GM of the Sonics, I have a little more hope this season than in previous seasons. There are cracks in the armor. I do really think next season is when it will get saucy for the Sonics. If Michael Lewis has anything more to offer next season, it's going to be spicy because the Jazz are going to hit some serious cap problems, and Michael Lewis could legit become like, I'm going to keep saying it, like if he can do what he does in regular season in the playoffs eventually one day, then the Sonics could take the cake. All right, I'm going to do the quick finals prediction here. The Jazz will annihilate the Heat. Not a lot to talk about. Even if the Sonics make it against the Heat, the Sonics will annihilate the Heat. When you just look at the differentials of these teams in the East and the teams in the West, it's wild. And the Hawks did have some good differentials themselves, and they just lost 4-0. But the Hawks have also been playoff chokers for a decade. Meanwhile, the Sonics and the Jazz have been playoff riser teams for this entire era that they've been going after it. So, yeah, we're going to be seeing whoever wins the Western Conference Finals will be winning the chip. So those are my predictions. Hopefully we get some drama. I definitely think the West, the stakes are higher, but I don't expect an upset. The East, the stakes are lower, but I think we could get some good drama. So the East is great for entertainment. The West, not so much. But those are my predictions. Hopefully we have a great end of the season. Go Sonics and Toodles.